Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of PaleoConservatism with Naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So, for this first inaugural episode, I want to just give a brief rundown of what my podcast is all about and what Neofusionism is. It's kind of a concept that I invented, and so I completely understand if you don't really know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to break it down for you in brief form today. I'm not going to review any books, just give you a kind of an overview. So hopefully this is not as long as the rest of the podcasts. I'll just kind of keep it short and sweet. Essentially, Neofusionism is a new sort of version of fusionism, a new merging of elements. Well, what's fusionism? Okay. In the 1950s and 60s, that was the early days of the National Review magazine, and it was sort of the creation of what we consider now to be the conservative movement. Conservatism was not really what it is now in the early part of the 20th century. It was a little bit different. Fusionism was proposed by Frank Meyer as sort of a merging that was, or it was already happening. It wasn't so much something that he proposed, but it was something that he identified and encouraged. It was the merging of libertarianism with traditionalism to form the conservative movement and to form what would become the backbone of the Republican Party. And that happened specifically as a response to global communism, the rise of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and socialist and communist forces within the American left. And as a response to the New Deal and the growth of government, the libertarians and the traditionalists sort of saw common ground, a common enemy, if you will, and basically joined forces in order to combat that. And so now what we consider conservatism has basically been that, some form of that for a while, some degree of merging between these two forces, these two premises, libertarianism and traditionalism. Now, that doesn't mean that all conservatism is the same nowadays. There are different branches and different ways of approaching this merging. The main two branches, I would say, are the neoconservatives and the paleoconservatives. Now, you can kind of get more fine-tuned than that and find a bunch of different types of conservatives, but I think that's really the main division. Of course, you have some people that are much more inclined toward the libertarian side, and then you have people that are much more inclined toward the traditionalist side. So, obviously not every conservative is going to look at things the same way. But the broad split, I think, has been between the neos and the paleos. Neoconservatives have been dominant in the Republican Party for a long time. And the paleos have kind of been this background voice that haven't had an awful lot of power, especially over the last 30 years or so. But they've been there. Pat Buchanan, I think, is generally considered one of the leading voices of the paleoconservative movement. You've got other people like Tom Fleming and some others that kind of represent the paleoconservative voice. A few publications like Chronicles magazine that are outlets for paleoconservative thought. American Conservative magazine sometimes leans in that direction. But I think that with the election of Donald Trump, the paleoconservative movement has come to the fore. Donald Trump is much more representative of paleo ideas. He really is in the mold of Pat Buchanan in a lot of ways. But, much more successful, for better or worse, than Pat Buchanan has been. But so the paleo movement is on the rise. A lot of people are getting behind Donald Trump's ideas, which are ultimately paleo ideas. Donald Trump is not really a neoconservative, I don't think, although, he has neoconservatives in his orbit, which I guess is not to be, not a surprise. If you're a Republican president of the United States, you're going to have neoconservatives in your orbit. I think that just is par for the course. Anyway, so I tend to think that the neoconservative agenda, which has been much more interested in spreading democracy across the globe and much more militaristic, whereas the paleoconservatives tend to be much more non-interventionist, the neoconservative movement is moving into the background and the paleoconservative movement is coming to the fore. I think this is a good thing. I think with the fall of the Soviet Union, we need to begin to look at things a little differently. So with that said, what is Neofusionism? Well, the original fusionism is already over and done with, right? The libertarians and the traditionalists are joined at the hip now. I don't think there's going to be a separation between those things. There may be some degree of separation, but by and large, modern conservatism just takes bits of both of them, and I think that's a done deal. But I think that there's another trend that's sort of beginning to unfold, and this is something that's just on the other side of the horizon, and we're starting to see it a bit with the rise of the intellectual dark web. And I think what we're seeing is ultimately there's kind of a grasping for the creation of a secular foundation for conservatism. I think that there's always going to be a Judeo-Christian component of conservatism that goes without saying, but there are a lot of people that don't identify as religious and that don't base their politics on religion, and I think that the Republican Party is going to begin to have to make avenues into conservatism that don't assume that the roots of conservatism are based in Christian doctrine. I think that's just coming down the pipeline. And I think part of what the intellectual dark web is doing, whether it realizes it or not, is kind of fumbling around trying to figure out, well, okay, this far left nonsense is not really appealing. It's actually kind of crazy. But at the same time, we're not really basing our belief systems on religion and supernatural phenomena and ancient stories and whatnot. And so I think there's just a movement afoot that I don't even know if people have really realized that's what they're doing, but I think that's what they're doing. So that's just my impression of what's going on. I think that will bear itself out over the course of the next several years. But so these two different trends of beginning to find a secular vision of conservatism and a trend toward a nationalistic, more paleoconservatism with more of a defensive economic and military posture. These two trends are going to converge just like libertarianism and traditionalism did in the face of a common enemy. And that common enemy, once again, is on the left. It's the cultural Marxism, the totalitarian left that we're beginning to see the rise of, the silencing, the censorship, the violence. People who are opposed to that are going to find themselves to be, in a common cause with each other. And so there's going to arise, I believe, basically a nationalistic, paleoconservative, secular version of conservatism. Conservatism is going to change. It always does. These political movements morph over time. Today's left is not Bill Clinton's left necessarily. It's not JFK's left. And today's right is changing as well. It went through a period of basically staying the same for a while. Reaganism was the dominant vision of conservatism. It's changing. People who are paying attention to what's going on in conservatism know it's changing. And it's not just becoming nationalistic, it's also becoming secular. Anyone who tries to look at the election of Donald Trump and says that's an indication that the conservative movement is returning to its Judeo-Christian roots, I think is drastically misreading the moment. Donald Trump is not a religious man. He makes overtures to the religious right because I believe that he thinks that he has to. I don't think he is a religious man in any way, shape, or form. It's just not his temperament. It's never been. I've never seen anything to indicate that to me. He pays it lip service because he has to. But there have been a long line of very religious conservatives, and nowadays they're not really prominent anymore. I mean, every conservative out there basically is in some greater or lesser degree religious, but it's really not anywhere near as common as it was, and it doesn't drive most of the conversation that is happening on the right, and I think less so and less so. Now, I don't think that I don't get me wrong and think that I'm saying that, religion or Christianity or anything needs to be somehow driven out of the Republican Party. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that there are a lot of people out there like myself who may have a conservative disposition or who may be fed up with everything that is going on the left and want to find an avenue into the right. But when they're told that the right is fundamentally rooted in Christianity or rooted in Judeo-Christian values or just religion in general, that you have to have a religion, you have to be religious in some way in order for conservatism to even make sense to you, that is your options, like go with the crazy left or become a religious conservative. That's not necessarily a satisfying option. The avenue has to exist for people like me and for many other people out there who maybe would like to be a conservative but don't want to take on that religious quality. It's not them, it's not me. Okay? So I am trying in this podcast to develop a secular foundation for conservatism. And I'm looking at science, and I'm also looking at philosophy. And so the other portion of what's kind of merging together is I call it in my podcast naturalism. But it's this secular foundation for conservatism that I spoke of. But I call it naturalism because, number one, philosophical naturalism is basically a view of the world that says there's no supernatural anything. Everything is material, natural. Everything is cause and effect. That is ultimately a secular reality. No room. I don't want to say no room for God, but no use for God as an explanation for anything that happens. Maybe somewhere in the Big Bang, but it's not like the woman made from the rib of man or any of these Garden of Eden, any of these doctrinal stories. Man evolved from animals. It's an evolutionary, all the stars are created, the planets are created through all natural forces. There's no hand of God in any of this. It's all just material. So that's philosophical naturalism, essentially. But I like the word naturalism because it also evokes the sense that we are going to look toward natural processes and natural phenomena and the natural world around us to get some of our guiding principles. And also that we're going to have a sense of reverence for nature. And I'll get into why I think that's fundamentally conservative. But I do think that, in brief, conservation is conservative. And there's not really, I don't believe, a logical way that we can dispute that. But I'm going to get into all these topics in a lot more detail later on. But there's the short and sweet of it. So I'm really interested in a number of things that I'm going to be focusing on. These include evolutionary psychology, traditionalist philosophy, existential philosophy, pragmatism, pragmatic philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, Aristotle. These are some of the things that really are interesting me at the moment and that I think can be used. So basically, I'm doing these book reviews. I'm going through a wide variety of books to pull out sort of nuggets of wisdom, if you will, bits and pieces of the books that speak to me and seem like they can provide some of the tools that we're going to be using as we craft this thing going forward. Now, I know that this is not really a thing out there in the world, that there's not like a whole host of people clamoring to say, oh, we're combining secular conservatism with nationalistic, paleoconservative impression, and we need a name for it. I realize but I think that this sort of thing is just in the very early stages, and I think that, my opinion, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you're going to start to see both of these trends really take over the Republican Party. I could be wrong, but either way, the Republican Party and conservatism in general sort of needs to have factions. It's healthy, because you can't just have a society in which there are two ideas. There's the left-wing idea and the right-wing idea, and that's it. Obviously there's in some ways dichotomies between thinking, but life is so much more complex than that. There are so many different ways of approaching political problems and social problems and philosophical problems that I think the Republican Party is going to have different factions within it. Like I mentioned, like a libertarian faction, a traditionalist faction, a religious faction, a secular faction, etc., in order to be the big tent that is needed to get enough people in to create electoral victories. So there you have it. I guess I'm going to wrap it up now. I didn't want to make this a long podcast. I just wanted to break it down in kind of simple form. I've got a number of ideas that are more detailed about this process, but those ideas are going to come out bit by bit as we go through these books. So you're going to have to follow along and watch me unpack these things in order to get the full story. I'll just say now that I really welcome any feedback, both on this episode and on any future episodes. If you think that maybe I'm onto something, or maybe I'm going in the right direction or the wrong direction, or you've got a book that you think would be a good fit for the podcast, reach out to me, neofusionist@gmail.com, and then, all the other information, contact information, everything. It's all on my website, www.neofusionist.com, facebook.com/neofusionist. My Twitter handle is @neofusionist, patreon.com/neofusionist. I'm sure you're getting the idea by now. So I'm going to wrap up this episode. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a stellar day.